She sat in the dust, her back against a cracked water barrel, holding a sign scrawled in uneven letters, "One meal for one night," until a cowboy claimed her before the others could. Before we ride into this tale, don't forget to hit that like button and tell us down in the comments where you're listening from. Red Hollow was the kind of place men drifted through to trade, drink, or vanish. The earth there was baked hard, the color of rusted iron, and the wind carried grit thick enough to sting your teeth. The trading post, one sagging building of split pine beams and a patched roof, leaned toward the corral like it had grown tired of standing straight. Nobody lingered outdoors without a reason yet that morning. A half-circle of townsmen had gathered near the porch, some pretending to whittle or smoke, others just staring. She stood apart by a few steps beside the barrels. Her bare feet were split at the heels, the skin tough and gray with dust and blood. The buckskin dress clung to her thin frame, torn across the ribs, where each breath pulled the seam wider. Another rip showed pale skin just above her hip. Under one arm, she held a stick with a scrap of cloth tied to it. The words read rough and crooked. "One food, isix, one night with me." Her gaze stayed low, not closed, only guarded. The tension in her shoulders told any man watching that she was one heartbeat away from bolting. Her breathing came shallow, not from modesty, but from the fear of what attention might bring. Men passed, slowing just long enough to read the sign or glance at her legs. Some sneered, thinking it funny. Others measured her like they might the price of a mule. None stepped forward. Her name, unknown to anyone in that godforsaken town, was Asha Skybird. She had walked for days after slipping free of a mining camp, a place run by a traitor who traded her safety for liquor. Hunger had cornered her. Shame had silenced her. The sign was her last scrap of control. She didn't want to sell herself, but starving alone in a ditch felt closer now than pride ever did. Tahu Stormwolf had no reason to linger in Red Hollow longer than it took to gather what he needed. He lived alone on a patch of land 12 miles east, where a shallow creek cut through mesquite and rock. He rode into town seldom always early, and spoke to no one if he could help it. He kept to shadows, his dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. A pale cavalry scar ran across his throat, something that made folks stare and then look away. His wool coat was worn thin at the elbows, his rolled sleeves dusted from the trail. That morning he came for feed salt cornmeal and a few needles to mend tack. His horse Kitchi waited near the well flanks, still damp from the ride in. While tightening the saddle strap, Tahu noticed a knot of men by the porch, all facing the same direction. Quiet crowds usually meant trouble. He meant to turn away until he saw the woman's sign. He looked at it for only a moment, yet something in her posture made him stop. Bare feet, split-skin eyes lowered. She hadn't come in with any wagon or group. He'd seen enough during his soldier years to recognize someone cornered with nowhere to run. He crossed the street without a word. Dust rose around his boots, coating the hem of his coat. The men parted slightly as he approached. He didn't look at them. His gaze fixed on her on the way. Her fingers clutched the stick on how her chin dipped when his shadow fell over her. One man muttered from the left. "You fixin' to bid Stormwolf we were lining up fair." Tahu ignored him. He stopped in front of her close, but not close enough to touch. From where he stood, he could see the bruises around her wrist, the hollowed lines of her cheeks, the sweat glistening along her hairline even in the cold. She still wouldn't lift her head. He reached forward not for her arm, but for the stick she gripped. She stiffened like someone waiting for a blow. He took the sign from her hands. She didn't fight, though every muscle in her body tightened. He lowered the stick until it hit the ground, the cloth flipping face down into the dust. She stayed still, breathing unevenly. Her hands rose to her chest, pulling the torn neckline together by reflex. Someone behind him snorted, "Real generous, Cowboy." "You planning to share her when you're done?" Tahu turned his head just enough for his gray eyes to meet the speaker's. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't raise his voice. The man dropped his stare after half a second, muttered something, and stepped back into the crowd. He didn't reach for the gun at his hip, didn't raise his voice. The man who had spoken caught that look in Tahu Stormwolf's eyes and dropped his gaze quick, mumbling something about minding his own damn business. Tahu pulled off his coat. The cold bit at his bare arms, raising gooseflesh, but he didn't pause. He laid the heavy wool around Asha Skybird's shoulders, careful not to touch her skin. She tensed, confused by the quiet restraint, instead of the rough grab she had come to expect. The coat hung loose and smelled faintly of smoke and horsehide. She gripped it tight at her collar, still refusing to meet his eyes. Tahu picked up the burlap sack resting by the well, then gave a single nod toward Kitchi, his horse. Only 2 words left his mouth. "Come on." Not barked, not a command, just plain steady like he expected her to understand the first time. She froze for a heartbeat, her thoughts split between 2 kinds of danger, the one standing before her and the one waiting if she stayed. He didn't grab her. He didn't push. He simply turned his back and walked toward his horse like the matter was already decided. The crowd of red, hollow townsmen shifted, expecting him to seize her, to drag her off her. But when he didn't, curiosity turned to silence. Asha hesitated, then followed, clutching the coat tighter as she stepped through the dust, leaving small, uneven prints behind her. Tahu loaded the feed onto the saddle and tightened the strap. When she stopped beside the horse, she stared at the stirrup, unsure if she was even allowed to touch it without paying first. He didn't offer to lift her. He didn't reach for her waist. He simply mounted from the far side, settled the reins, and waited. If she wanted to follow, it would be her choice. His reason for taking her had nothing to do with pity. He knew damn well what those men would do if he left her standing there. He had seen soldiers' men in uniform once called his brothers commit worse acts against women with even less chance to run. He wasn't saving her. He was stopping something uglier. Asha's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her ears. She didn't know if he meant to use her, or if he planned to drop her in the wilderness and ride on. But the weight of the coat, the calm in his silence, and the fact that he hadn't once looked at her body told her he was different. She climbed up behind him. Her hands never touched his back, only the rear of the saddle horn. She stared straight ahead, saying nothing. No one tried to stop them. Kitchi stepped forward, hooves breaking the dirt as the wind swept their tracks away faster than the crowd dispersed. The sign she had held fluttered in the street until a gust shoved it against the water trough, the words half buried in dust. The road out of Red Hollow was little more than a trail carved through scrub and sun-hardened clay. Kitchi's hooves struck up pale clouds that hung low in the morning air. Tahu rode steady loose on the reins, the town shrinking behind them. The cold bit through his shirt where the coat used to be, but he didn't look back. Asha sat rigid at first, gripping the saddle's back, unsure how near she was allowed to be. Every jolt of the horse pushed her knees against his hips, and each accidental brush made her brace for the worst. After a while, she adjusted, pulling the coat tighter around her chest. The fabric held his scent, wood smoke, sweat, leather familiar in a way that wasn't cruel. Not the stench of rot or whiskey she'd known before. She waited for him to speak, to name his price. He said nothing. They rode for over an hour, the land opening into rolling humps of mesquite and stone. The sky flattened into a wide, pale blue, the kind that made the earth look endless. Hunger twisted her belly now that fear had begun to fade. The burlap sack he'd handed her lay across her lap. She could smell cornmeal and dried meat inside, but she didn't dare open it. When a narrow creek shimmered ahead, cutting through the rocky bed, Tahu finally spoke. "Water, the horse," he said, voice calm, neither kind nor cold, just matter-of-fact. He swung down and tied Kitchi to a low mesquite branch. Then he stepped back, waiting for her to climb down on her own. She hesitated, expecting a pull or a shove. When none came, she slid off carefully, landing hard on her cracked feet. Pain shot through her soles, but she didn't make a sound. Tahu's eyes flicked to the cuts on her feet, but he said nothing. He loosened the saddle cinch and let Kitchi drink. Asha stood a few steps away, holding the coat tight, unsure whether to follow or stand still. The creek was clear water sliding over stones and sand. She wanted to kneel and drink to wash the dust from her face, but she waited for his signal. Tahu cupped his hands, splashed water over his face once, then nodded toward the stream. "Drink if you need. No gesture, no coaxing, just quiet permission." Tahu Stormwolf kept most of his attention on Kitchi, though he watched Asha Skybird from the corner of his eye, measuring whether she understood what was allowed. She moved slowly, kneeling by the bank, dipping her hands into the cold creek. She didn't gulp the water like an animal she drank in small, careful sips, her eyes never leaving the edge of the shore in case he changed his mind. The water slid down her wrists, disappearing into the sleeves of his coat. When she finished, he reached into his saddlebag and handed her a strip of dried venison. She froze, staring at it, waiting for him to name a price. "Eat," he said simply, not as a request and not as a bargain. She accepted it hesitantly, chewing in small, guarded bites. He said nothing more. When Kitchi had finished drinking, Tahu tightened the cinch and gathered the reins again. Mounting the saddle, he didn't offer her a hand, just waited until she chose to climb up behind him. This time, when the horse started forward, she gripped the back of his shirt instead of the saddle horn. It wasn't trust, only the instinct to keep from falling. The land began to rise, stretching into pale pasture and thin patches of mesquite. Far ahead, jagged rocks cut a dark line against the sky, the edge of his land. He hadn't had a visitor in over a year. Not a prospector, not a drifter, not even a lost soul. The last woman who had crossed that threshold had been Naya Moonfeather, and she'd still been breathing. The memory pressed at the edges of his mind, uninvited. He pushed it down. Asha noticed the landscape changing, the corral fence leaning tired under the wind, the uneven logs of the small cabin, and the frame of a second room half-built and abandoned. The sawhorses stood frozen in place like ghosts of work left unfinished. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney this time of day, though the ashes inside still held a whisper of warmth. When Tahu stopped by the trough, he swung his leg over and stepped to the ground. She stayed seated, unsure if she had the right to step on his land without permission. He untied the feed sack, looked up at her, and said, "You can get down." She slid off carefully, nearly stumbling, when her feet touched the hard dirt. A loose board creaked in the porch wind. A few spirit birds darted from behind the cabin, scratching at the ground. The air smelled of cold earth, old wood, and smoke baked deep into the walls. Tahu lifted the latch on the door and pushed it open. "Go on in." He didn't force her ahead, didn't touch her, didn't block the way. Inside the cabin was small but sturdy. A single bed rested against the far wall beside a pot-belly stove. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood near the center. A trunk sat by the foot of the bed, and a pile of cut wood leaned in the corner. A rifle hung above the doorframe. Through the open frame of the unfinished addition, Sunlight slipped across raw beams and unsealed boards. Asha stepped inside, carefully hugging the coat tighter around her. She waited for the sound of the door shutting for his boots behind her for instructions or demands. Instead, Tahu set the provisions on the table and crouched by the stove, stirring through the cold ash. He added kindling struck flint until a spark caught, and soon thin smoke curled up the chimney. She stood by the door, unsure if she should remove his coat or keep it on. Her eyes flicked toward the bed, bracing for him to order her there. He didn't. He kept his back turned, shifting coals with the poker. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, his voice was steady. "Sit if you want. You're not being used here." It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't a threat either. Her fingers clenched tighter around the coat, and she lowered her gaze, stepping toward the table, but not sitting yet, unsure if his words truly meant what they sounded like. He took a tin cup from the shelf, filled it from a jug, and set it in front of the empty chair closest to her. He didn't wait for thanks. Questions filled the silence between them: what he wanted, why he'd brought her if she was supposed to leave after she'd eaten. But she stayed quiet. Her English was thin-shaped in pieces that might offend if used wrong. Tahu Stormwolf watched her from the side of the table. He didn't know her name, her story, or what to do with her now that she was here. He only knew one thing: she wouldn't survive long on her own, and the thought of sending her back to Red Hollow made something in his gut twist hard. Before either of them spoke again, he struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the table, even though daylight still lingered outside. The glow filled the room, revealing the hollows in her cheeks and the tremor in her arms. Asha's eyes traveled around the cabin, studying the rough furniture, the bed, the rifle, the empty frame of the unfinished room, trying to measure the price of crossing that door. Whatever came next would force choices neither of them were ready to name. The warmth from the stove spread slowly through the room, chasing off the chill that clung to her skin. Yet she stayed near the table, still afraid that one wrong move might change his mind about letting her stay. Tahu Stormwolf removed his hat and hung it on the hook by the door before reaching for another log to feed the fire. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand she speak, but the silence between them carried a weight heavier than either could name. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who'd both run out of safe words. Asha Skybird finally lowered herself into the chair he'd left pulled out. The coat slipped from one shoulder, revealing the torn strap of her dress and the bruises shadowing her collarbone. She quickly tugged it back up, glancing toward him to see if he'd been watching. He had noticed, but he didn't look away, pretending he hadn't. He didn't stare either. That unsettled her more than hunger or shame ever had. He reached into the burlap sack, pulling out a small bundle of dried venison and a pouch of cornmeal. From a shelf above the stove, he took down a tin pot and filled it with water, setting it on the stovetop to warm. Asha watched every movement like a cornered animal, waiting for the moment he'd name her debt. But he didn't. He only said, "You'll eat warm," as though that needed no explanation at all. Her eyes wandered the cabin, searching for signs of another presence. Maybe a woman, maybe a child. Something to tell her this wasn't a trap. She saw 2 tin cups on the shelf, a pair of worn boots by the trunk, a folded blanket draped near the door. No dresses, no hair comb. No sewing kit except a small roll of needles and thread by the table. That eased one fear, but sharpened another. If there was no one else here, there'd be no one to stop him either. Her voice cracked through the quiet rough from disuse. "Why you take—" The English felt clumsy, but keeping it inside hurt worse. Tahu didn't answer right away. He stirred the steaming pot with a wooden spoon, keeping his eyes on the rising heat. "Didn't want to see them decide what to do with you. It wasn't the whole truth, and she could feel it. Her hands tightened around the edge of the coat. "You want later?" she asked softly, bracing herself for what came next. He stopped stirring, set the spoon down, and said evenly, "I'm not here to take payment. You eat, you sleep." Then, after a pause, "That's it for now." Those last two words, "for now," made her chest tighten. She didn't know if he meant later would change, or if that was just his way of talking. Trusting a man's tone had broken her before. He ladled boiling water into a bowl, mixed in the cornmeal until it thickened, then dropped in bits of venison. He set the bowl in front of her, a spoon beside it. No warning. No demand. Just food. Her hands hovered above the bowl, unsure if she should wait for him to eat first. When he turned back to the stove to fill his own plate, she began eating fast, one hand clutching the coat around her chest. The food burned her tongue, but she didn't stop. Tahu ate, standing, leaning against the counter, his silence steady. He wasn't used to talking during meals, not after years of eating alone in a cabin built for two. He'd once brought in laborers, a drifter or two, even a fevered boy once, but never a woman. The last woman who had slept under this roof had been Naya Moonfeather, and she had died in the bed now sitting behind him. He didn't let his mind stay there long. While Asha ate, he walked to the far corner, pulling a small wooden crate from beside the cot. Inside were old hides, scraps of leather, and a pair of moccasins, cracked but whole. He set them on the floor beside the table. "For your feet," he said quietly, not looking up. She froze mid-bite. "You give?" she asked, disbelief breaking through the words. "They're no use sittin' in a box," he answered, turning back to the stove. When she finished eating, she placed the spoon carefully on the table, her eyes flicking between him and the door. She didn't ask to stay. She didn't have the words for that. But she didn't stand to leave either. Tahu took her bowl, ran his thumb along the rim to see if she'd eaten it all, not out of doubt, but to measure how long it had been since she'd last had real food. He rinsed the bowl in the water bucket, wiping it dry with the cleanest rag he had. "You'll wash after you rest," he said, nodding toward the stove. "There's a basin behind it. I'll heat water later." She didn't nod, but she didn't flinch either. Her eyes drifted to the bed, then to the cot near the door. He caught the look. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep there." He gestured toward the cot. Her breath caught, not in fear this time, but in disbelief. She wasn't used to being given the choice. Most men put her on the floor, or worse. Tahu stepped to the door, cracked it open, and looked out into the yard. The wind stirred the dry grass, nothing else moved. "Nobody followed us," he said, then added, "but some in town will remember your face." It wasn't a threat, just truth spoken plain as dust. Her voice came quiet, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. "Name." Isaac Tahu. Stormwolf paused before answering Tahu, Stormwolf. She hesitated, then said softly, "Asha." She spoke it like the name belonged to someone she used to be. He gave a single nod. He hadn't spoken his own name aloud in days, maybe weeks. The cabin fell into a silence that wasn't empty, just waiting. Less like two strangers sharing space, more like two people caught between decisions neither could take back. Outside, the wind brushed against the corral fence, rattling dry branches. Inside, the fire dimmed low, painting her face in faint light. Asha Skybird slipped her sore feet into the moccasins and drew the coat tighter, waiting to see if rest meant safety or just a pause before something else was taken from her. Night fell without ceremony. Tahu stepped outside before the last of the light died, checking on Kitchi and shutting the spirit bird's coop. The air bit colder, with every minute sharp enough to sting his bare arms. With his coat still around her shoulders, The wind cut straight through his shirt, but he didn't take it back. He didn't ask for it, either. Asha stood in the doorway, unsure if stepping out without his word would be seen as running. He hadn't told her to stay inside, but habit kept her rooted there, her eyes following him as he moved across the yard. She scanned the land beyond the cabin, empty hills, brittle brush, a stretch of silence too wide to trust. She half expected to see men riding over the ridge the way they had before. But nothing moved except the wind bending grass and the horse shifting his weight. She wondered how far Red Hollow really was now, how easy it would be for anyone to track her. If those men remembered her face, would they bother to come? And if they did, would this man fight for her again? Or decide she wasn't worth the trouble? Inside, she tested the floorboards, memorizing which ones creaked. There were no locks on the door. The rifle above the frame was clean polished but untouched. She noticed the things that weren't there too. No liquor bottles, no cards, no second pair of boots. Just one man's life, lived alone. When Tahu came back in, he latched the door and lit another oil lamp. Shadows stretched across the walls into clearer shapes. He grabbed a spare blanket from the cot and hesitated the first flicker of uncertainty she'd seen in him. He didn't know what else she needed, or what she feared he might take. But he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving her out in the cold. She spoke first, testing him. "You were soldier." Her words were rough, but her eyes were steady. He didn't flinch. Was he said short and flat? Long time ago. She glanced toward the pale scar running along his neck, the one that caught light every time he turned his head. "Enemy, or your man?" she asked, carefully, not to pry, but to learn what kind of ghosts he carried. He met her gaze, calm, unreadable. "Doesn't matter now." His tone wasn't sharp, but it closed the door on the past. Some wounds weren't meant for company. Asha looked away. The stove popped and clicked against the iron sides, and the soft heat filled the silence between them. Her eyes drifted to the bed. She'd slept in worse on dirt, in wagons beneath men who thought her body was payment. The sight of a mattress felt almost unreal, like it belonged to another lifetime. Tahu must have seen the thought cross her face, because he nodded toward the wooden basin beside the stove. "I'll heat water. You can wash before sleep." He said it like a simple truth, not a favor, not a bargain. He filled the pot again, setting it over the flames. She waited, unsure whether taking off the coat or loosening her torn dress would be seen as invitation. He turned his back, giving her space, and began unrolling his blanket on the cot by the door. "You close eyes?" she asked quietly, not daring to move. "I'm not turning around," he said, voice steady. "Not unless this place catches fire." It wasn't a promise of decency. It was permission not to be afraid. When the water began to steam, he poured it into the basin and fetched a smaller cloth from a shelf. He set it beside her, then returned to his cot. Asha waited a moment before moving. With her back to him, she slipped out of the coat and pulled the dress down just enough to wash away the dust and sweat. The bruises along her ribs and hips were deep purple-black under her skin. She worked slowly, careful not to tear the seams further. She dipped the cloth, wiping her arms, her neck, her face, keeping one arm across her chest the whole time. Tahu Stormwolf kept his focus on unrolling his bedroll and checking the latch again, but the sounds reached him anyway, the soft slosh of water, the faint hiss of cloth against skin, and the uneven breaths of someone trying not to show pain. Old memories slipped through before he could stop them. Naya Moonfeather, rinsing her hands after stitching a shirt, the soft drip of water from her hair, the faint smell of lye that lingered from the last night she spoke. Tahu Stormwolf forced the memory down, until all that was left was the creak of floorboards and the steady pop of firewood in the stove. When Asha Skybird finished washing, she pulled his coat back on, leaving the torn dress in a heap near the basin. The coat swallowed her shape, now loose around her shoulders, showing just how thin she'd become. "You want other clothes?" he asked, noticing her hesitation, as her eyes flicked toward the bed. Her gaze drifted to the trunk at its foot. "Woman here?" Before. The words were soft, uncertain, but direct. "My wife," he said quietly. "She's buried south of here." His tone didn't falter. It wasn't grief, just a truth too old to sting. Asha absorbed it in silence. No woman would be coming back to reclaim that bed that answered the question she hadn't known how to ask. He nodded toward the mattress. "Sleep. Door stays shut. No one gets close without me hearing first." She moved cautiously, testing each floorboard, like it might give beneath her weight. The mattress sagged a little as she sat, then eased down slowly. She looked at him once, not seeking permission, only trying to read the truth in his face. Tahu stretched out on the cot, pulling a blanket up over his chest. The rifle above the door stayed within reach. His eyes didn't close until she finally lay down fully. She didn't take off the coat. She curled on top of the blanket, one hand beneath her cheek, the other gripping the collar closed. Exhaustion dragged harder than fear now. Her eyes shut in slow defense, ready to snap open at the first wrong sound. Tahu listened to her breathing settle uneven at first, then steady. He stayed awake longer than needed, not out of distrust, but habit. The last time someone had slept beneath his roof, he'd lost them before morning. The coals dropped low, throwing a faint red glow across the walls. Outside, no boots in the dirt, no men from Red Hollow, no knocking, no dogs barking. Just the wind sliding past the cabin and the quiet rhythm of a woman who hadn't slept safely in weeks, finding rest in worn cotton and wool. He closed his eyes only when he knew she wouldn't bolt before dawn. The night passed without trouble. No strangers in the yard, no hinges creaking, no shouts. When the first light bled through the small window, the cabin still held the last traces of warmth from the stove. Tahu woke before the sun climbed the ridge. Years of light sleeping made that easy. He didn't rise right away. He listened first for movement, for breath, for the sound of bare feet on the floor. Asha hadn't moved much through the night. Now she stirred slow and cautious, as though making sure the world around her hadn't changed. The coat had slipped halfway down her shoulder. She adjusted it quietly, hoping not to draw notice. Tahu sat up on the cot and swung his legs over the side. She watched him from the bed, alert, but not afraid. For a long moment, neither spoke. He stood stretched the stiffness from his back and set the rifle on its hooks again. Her eyes darted toward the door, then the window, still measuring escape routes, still expecting ghosts. He broke the silence first. "You hungry?" It wasn't a question. He stirred the ashes until a flame sparked again. The air filled with the faint scent of smoke and iron. He poured water into the pot and reached for the cornmeal bag. Asha Skybird sat up the coat covering her legs, her hair tangled around her face. This time she didn't wait for permission. She rose, crossed to the basin, and splashed cold water on her hands and cheeks. Tahu noticed her bare legs beneath the hem of the coat, bruises healed cuts, skin marked by hard travel. He didn't look twice. "Food'll be ready soon," he said simply, turning back to the pot. While the water heated, he stepped outside to fetch more wood. Asha moved closer to the door, not to follow, but to listen. She strained for sounds of voices, gunfire, or the rattle of saddles. Nothing. Only the scrape of kindling, the soft rustle of spirit birds pecking at the dirt. When he returned, she was still by the doorway, arms crossed tight around the coat. He stacked the wood by the stove and nodded toward the table. Sit. She hesitated, then obeyed this time, keeping her back to the wall instead of the open room. He cooked in silence, the same quiet rhythm as the night before. When he set a bowl in front of her, and another before himself, she waited for talk of payment or work, or maybe being sent back to town. Instead, he sat across from her and began to eat steady, unhurried, as if this were any other morning in the wilderness. She ate slower than the night before, but with more care. The warmth from the stove mixed with the smell of corn and smoke, and for the first time in weeks, her hands stopped trembling. She ate slower this time, less afraid the food might vanish before she was done. Still, her eyes flicked up between bites, studying Tahu Stormwolf, his hands, his shoulders, the quiet shifts in his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, uncertain. "I work today," she said, each word chosen like it might tip the balance. Tahu looked up from his bowl. "There's wood to haul in, and the spirit birds need feedin'. But you only do what you can. I didn't bring you here to wear you out." The words "wear you out" hit deep. Too close to what had been done to her before. She lowered the spoon, eyes searching his face, trying to understand what he wanted, if not that. "You take me. Why not woman? Not servant?" He met her stare for a long moment. "Didn't take you for what you could give me. I took you so those bastards in Red Hollow wouldn't decide for you. That's all I knew then." He didn't dress it up as heroism, and she could feel that honesty. The silence between them carried a kind of fragile weight, one that felt almost safe. Then came the question that mattered most. I stay, or I go. If he said go, she would. With nothing but his coat and a bit of food, even if it meant dying before another sunrise. "You stay for now," he said. "Nobody's coming for you here." He didn't explain how long for now meant. Truth was, he hadn't decided himself. Asha Skybird picked up the spoon again. This time she ate the rest slowly with measured calm. When the bowls were empty, she gathered them and carried them to the basin without being told. Her movements were surer now, less like someone waiting to be struck. Tahu watched her rinse the dishes before stepping outside. The horizon was quiet. No dust trails, no riders, no tracks in the yard. Red Hollow lay far enough that talk wouldn't reach him quick, and most of those men had too little spine to follow him this far into Stormwolf land. Still, he watched the ridgeline out of habit. When he came back inside, she was standing near the table, uncertain again, waiting for instruction. He pointed toward the pair of moccasins beside the door. "Try 'em on. Ground here's rougher than town." She slipped them over her feet. They were worn but soft, the leather molding around her skin. Not a perfect fit, but better than bleeding barefoot through the brush. He noticed her torn dress still crumpled by the basin. "There's cloth and thread. You can mend that or take something from the trunk." That trunk had sat untouched for years. Inside lay Naya Moonfeather's things, a few shirts, a faded shawl, a skirt with a torn hem, a small pouch of buttons. Offering them wasn't easy, but leaving Asha in rags was worse. She hesitated. "Your woman. Gone long." He nodded once. 3 winters. She didn't pry. Loss was something she understood without needing translation. The wind rattled the half-built frame of the unfinished room. Her eyes followed the sound. "You build for child." His jaw tightened slightly. He looked toward the half-finished wall. Was buildin' for one. Didn't finish. She nodded slowly. No pity, just quiet understanding. Pain recognized pain. He opened the door again, cold air sweeping in. If you're strong enough, help me bring in wood. If not, stay warm inside. Nobody's gonna force you. Asha rose, clutching his coat tighter, the moccasins snug on her feet. She stepped outside without hesitation. The cold wasn't as sharp as the memory of men's eyes in town. The world beyond Red Hollow looked wider now, cleaner. She followed Tahu to the woodpile. He split logs with slow, practiced strength, and she gathered the smaller pieces, carrying them to the porch in quiet rhythm. She worked carefully, gauging how much she could do before it might anger him, but he didn't rush her, didn't measure her effort. He just kept swinging the axe, each strike echoing like thunder against the hills. After a while, she paused and looked back at the road they had come from. Men come here. Sometimes. Her voice was low, the question heavy with worry. Traders pass now and then. Neighbor 2 miles north, he said without looking up. They don't ride out this way unless there's reason. If anyone comes for you. He drove the axe down, splitting another log clean. I'll know why. She held on to those 4 words, like something she could finally believe in. By midday, the air between them had softened, not warm yet, but no longer sharp enough to sting. They moved through the day with quiet rhythm, each finding a kind of purpose in small, simple work. Tahu Stormwolf showed Asha Skybird where the chicken feed was kept. She scattered grain carefully, her bare feet stirring dust, while the spirit birds pecked at her ankles and clucked like gossiping old women. He tended to Kitchi, checking the horse's hooves and refilling the trough before the next freeze set in. When she came back to the porch, he finally asked what he'd been avoiding. Not curiosity, just necessity. Anyone out there looking for you? If danger was coming, he needed to know how close. Asha weighed the question, her gaze distant, voice small. Only men who want use. No family come. No tribe come. There was a hard finality in her tone, like she was done being claimed by anyone. Tahu gave a slow nod. For the first time since he'd found her clutching that sign in Red Hollow, he realized she had nowhere to go and maybe nowhere left to return to. By late afternoon, the sky turned steel gray, heavy with wind. He brought in another armload of wood, while she tucked his coat closer around her shoulders and fed the fire until the stove glowed red. The silence had changed. It wasn't strained anymore, just full of things neither of them knew how to say. Still small moments carried ghosts. When he reached over her shoulder to grab the poker, she flinched before realizing he wasn't trying to touch her. He noticed. Didn't say a word. Just stepped back and gave her room. He nodded toward the trunk at the foot of the bed. Clothes in there? Some might fit. You don't have to wear that thing another night. She stayed crouched for a beat, eyes darting toward the trunk as if expecting a trap. Then she rose, crossed the room, and lifted the lid. Inside were a few pieces, a faded skirt, a wool shawl, an undershirt, and a blue blouse that smelled faintly of cedar. She touched the fabric like it might vanish beneath her fingers. These hers, she asked quietly. No accusation, just awareness. Some, Tahu said. Some were meant for the baby. Never used. His tone was flat, matter-of-fact. He didn't soften it. Asha kept her eyes on the clothes. She didn't say she was sorry. Sorrow never fixed anything. She chose the blouse and skirt too big but clean and folded them neatly over her arm. I wash first, she said. She didn't want to wear anything new while still covered in old dirt and old hands. Tahu nodded and went out to draw more water. When he came back, he set the bucket beside the door and pried off the lid. Warm it first. Soap's by the kettle. She waited until he stepped away before pouring the water into the basin. The floor didn't creak as much this time. Maybe it trusted her a little more now. She stripped the torn dress, laid it near the fire, and washed quickly silent, careful like someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Each time the cloth passed over her bruises, her breath hitched soft and sharp. Tahu sat at the table, whittling wood, pretending focus, but every sound reached him. The splash of water, the rough swallow of pain she tried to hide. And in those sounds came memory Naya Moonfeather, humming by that same basin, her hands round with life that never came to be. When Asha finished, she dressed in the skirt and blouse, then pulled his coat over everything again. The fabric hung loose around her thin frame sleeves, falling nearly to her knuckles. She smoothed them anyway, adjusting the collar like it mattered. Tahu looked up once when she moved toward the table to collect the empty bowls. His eyes lingered just long enough to register the change, less worn, less ghost-like, but he said only, "Better than freezin' in rags." That was as close to kindness as he knew how to sound. She lifted the torn dress from the floor and held it by the seam. "I fix this. Tomorrow. There's thread and needle on the shelf," he said, nodding toward the window. "Light's better there." She folded the dress over the chair back and nodded once. The tension in her shoulders was still there, but now it wasn't fear keeping her upright. It was something new, something almost like belonging. She moved through the cabin like someone still waiting for a hand to stop her, but it never came. That night the wind rose fierce and low, scraping across the plains and rattling the half-built frame of the second room. Tahu Stormwolf checked the shutters and braced the door with a beam he kept behind it, just as habit had taught him. He set another log in the fire, the flames snapping against the iron grate, then cleaned his knife in the dim orange light. Asha Skybird sat at the table, head bent over her work. The needle in her hand moved steady and sure, mending a sleeve first, then closing the tear along the side. Her stitches were careful, neat, each one a quiet act of defiance against what had broken her before. Tahu watched from the corner of his eye. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. Last night they'd shaken so badly she could barely hold a spoon. Now, though, even when the needle pricked her thumb and drew a bead of blood, she didn't stop. She just wiped it on the cloth and kept sewing. The question hung between them like smoke. Would anyone from Red Hollow come looking for the woman who'd disappeared with him? Before fear could tighten her voice, he said evenly, "Men in town won't ride far. They'd have to admit what they were doing to come after you." She kept her gaze on the cloth. "Maybe they remember my face," she said softly. They remembered it before he answered. Still kept their distance. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It carried the weight of uneasy trust. Something small but real shifted in the air. Later he handed her a wool blanket from the trunk, then another for the bed. She didn't ask for his coat back, and he didn't mention it. When she finally lay down, she pulled the top blanket over herself, and for the first time slipped beneath it, instead of lying stiff on top. He took his usual place on the cot, boots off, trousers still on. The rifle stayed within arm's reach. In the dark, her voice came soft and uncertain. "You think I leave when food gone?" He didn't turn his head. "You leave when you choose? Or if this place becomes unsafe? Not before." That wasn't tenderness, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something in between, the kind of truth that built slow trust. She didn't answer, just exhaled and let the quiet pull her toward sleep. Tahu stayed awake a while longer, listening to the wind groan against the boards, thinking about asking her how she'd ended up there, whether Wicasa Blackhorn's men had sold her off, or whether her own Skybird clan had cast her out. but questions could wait. Tonight, there were only two things that mattered. The door was barred, and the fire was alive. When he finally slept, it wasn't the rest of a lonely man, but not yet that of someone who'd stopped guarding his heart. Across the room, the woman who had once begged for a meal slept deeply for the first time in weeks, with both eyes closed. By morning, the wind had quieted, leaving behind a pale, colorless sky. The cabin still held the warmth from the fire. Asha woke slowly, her body remembering the old reflex to startle, but there was no shouting, no boots on the floorboards, no door creaking open. Only the sound of Tahu moving at the table, the soft scrape of tin against wood. She sat up, wool blanket sliding to her waist. His coat still hung around her shoulders, heavy and safe. He didn't scold her for sleeping late. He just poured water into the pot, sleeves rolled quiet as sunrise. She folded her mended dress and laid it neatly on the trunk. The borrowed blouse and skirt fit better now that she'd tied the waist with a strip of cloth. Her moccasins were already on when he spoke. Wind knocked down part of the fence behind the corral, he said. I'll fix it before noon. You stay close to the cabin. She studied him, searching for something more in his voice. If men come, she asked, you tell them what. Her English was halting, but the meaning was sharp as a blade. Do you send me out or stand in front of me? He didn't flinch. Depends who comes and why. But nobody's taken you off this land without going through me first. That was the first time he'd said it plain. She didn't thank him. She'd learned gratitude could turn to debt, but her shoulders eased enough for him to notice. He split the last of the kindling and fed the stove. Before he could reach for the kettle, Asha stepped forward. I make breakfast, she said. She didn't ask permission. She said it like work that needed doing. He nodded and stepped aside. She moved slower than someone well-fed, but with more purpose than the frightened woman he'd brought home from the dust of Red Hollow. While she stirred the pot, Tahu Stormwolf checked the rifle once, then hung his hat on the hook again, just in case this morning meant something worth staying for. As the water began to steam, Asha Skybird moved around the stove with quiet focus, copying Tahu Stormwolf's steady rhythm from the morning before, how he'd stirred, how he'd timed the simmer. She didn't ask what to do. She already knew by watching. At the table, Tahu sat sharpening a knife, the soft scrape of metal filling the silence. His gaze flicked now and then toward the window, searching for the faintest trail of dust that might mean riders from Red Hollow. Asha paused, spoon in hand, eyes still on the bubbling pot. You tell them I am wife? She asked carefully, or nothing? He stopped. His motion wiped the blade clean on a cloth and met her eyes. If someone from town rides out here, he said I'll tell them whatever keeps them from asking questions. If calling you my wife makes them leave you alone, that's what I'll say. She let those words sink in, testing them the way someone tests the strength of ice before stepping on it. You say that because you want that, she pressed, or only words? It wasn't a challenge. It was a woman asking what kind of protection she was under. You're not here to be used, he said evenly. And you're not being sent back. That's as far as I've decided. It wasn't a vow, but it wasn't indifference either. And somehow that steadiness was enough to make her pulse quiet for the first time in days. When the stew was done, she set 2 bowls on the table and sat across from him without waiting to be told. They ate slow this time, without the desperate hunger of before. The silence between them had shifted again, not soft, but bearable. Halfway through the meal, she set her spoon down and looked straight at him. You not want me for body, she said, voice low but steady. Then why you look at me? The question wasn't anger, it was survival. She needed to know where his eyes stopped, and his hands wouldn't go. Tahu didn't pretend not to understand. He met her gaze with calm, unflinching honesty. You're here. I see you. Looking don't mean taking. He left the words at that. She studied his face a moment longer than she would have dared with any other man. Then she rose and began to clear the bowls. He stood, grabbed his coat, and said, "Fence won't fix itself. If you're strong enough, come along. If not, stay by the fire." She didn't answer, just followed him out. The wind had eased, leaving behind only the sigh of dry grass brushing against the corral. A loose board creaked where last week's rain had softened the earth. Tahu dropped to one knee, setting his tools down, and checked the fence post. Without being told, Asha crouched beside him and held the rail steady while he worked. After a while, she spoke again, quiet but sure. "You have people, family." He didn't pause, didn't soften his tone. "Had a brother once buried east of here. Parents gone before the war. Wife and boy, too. No dramatics. Just truth laid bare." She lowered her eyes. "Then no woman come say I must leave?" "No," he said simply. "No woman coming to take your place if that's what you're asking." That was enough. She shifted her grip on the rail, holding it steady while he hammered the nails back in place. He watched the way she worked, careful, efficient, stronger than he'd expected. When they finished, he stood and glanced toward the ridge where the sun had begun to dip low. "I don't plan to take you back to Red Hollow," he said. "But if you ever want to go, tell me before you walk off. I won't chase you unless something dangerous follows behind you." She thought about that, then asked, "If danger follow you, still stop it." He looked her dead in the eye. "If someone comes for you, they meet me first." There was no promise of love, no softness in his tone, but it carried a kind of protection that meant more than either word. They walked back toward the cabin together, tools slung over his shoulder. Overhead, a hawk circled lazy above the valley, its cry sharp against the open sky. The world felt wide enough now to bury the memory of the sign she once held in the dirt. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady. Her coat hung from her shoulders like it finally belonged there. For the first time since she'd stepped onto his land, Asha Skybird closed the cabin door behind her and didn't look back toward the road. By dusk, the wind had died completely. Tahu. Stormwolf brought in the last bucket of water from the barrel and set it by the stove. The quiet that filled the room wasn't the kind that haunted it, was the kind that held a fragile peace neither of them dared to name. Asha Skybird had already folded the mended dress neatly over the chair, the leftover scraps of fabric tucked away beside the needle and thread. The cabin no longer felt like a borrowed shelter. Her things, however few, didn't look like they belonged to someone passing through. They looked placed. She struck a match and lit the oil lamp without waiting for Tahu Stormwolf to nod. The first nights she'd hesitated, waiting for his permission to light a flame, as if brightness itself might be something she had to earn. Now she cupped her hand over the flicker, the same way she'd seen him do, shielding it from the wind sneaking through the cracks. He wiped the dirt from his palms with a rag and set his tools back on the shelf. The silence between them had changed again. It wasn't sharp anymore, but it still held its shape, quiet, cautious, edged by two people who knew what it meant to survive alone too long. As she stirred the stew, her voice broke the quiet, low and careful. "In Red Hollow, men look at you strange. They know you fight." Before, Tahu didn't pretend he hadn't earned those looks. "They've seen what happens when someone tries me," he said simply. "Word spreads fast enough to keep most of them from testing it again." Her gaze lingered on him. "You kill. It wasn't fear she was asking with, it was understanding. The kind of question that weighed whether a man's violence came from cruelty or necessity. "I have," he said. "Not for pay and not for pride. But when something needs ending, I don't lose sleep doing it." She gave a single nod and turned back to the pot. That answer was enough. When she brought the food to the table, she didn't wait for his cue to sit. They ate slow, quiet, unhurried. She didn't count the bites left in her bowl anymore. She didn't glance at the door between mouthfuls. When they finished, she wiped the bowls clean and left them to dry. He checked the window latches, the door beam, and the half-built frame of the second room. The roof still needed work. He'd thought more than once about letting it rot. But now with her here, leaving things unfinished felt like an invitation to danger. She noticed the way he kept glancing toward it. "You fixed that room?" she asked, stepping closer, her tone not that of a guest, but of someone measuring where she might belong. "If the roof holds through winter," he said, "I'll finish it in spring." Then, after a pause, "Could be yours if you ever need space apart." Asha looked toward the skeletal frame, open beams, no door, no walls, imagining what it might feel like to have 4 of her own. Then she turned to him, her voice quieter. "You think I run? Take coat leave you?" He didn't flinch. "Thought you might the first night," he said. "Not now. But if you did, I wouldn't come after you unless someone else was chasing." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Most men lied before they reached for what they wanted. This one just said what was true. She hesitated, then spoke the first piece of her past she'd ever given freely. "I left my people. My choice. Not stolen, not sold." Her hand stayed busy with the spoon, but her eyes didn't meet his. "My tribe cast me out when I would not take the man they chose. They called me a traitor to blood and law." Tahu leaned a shoulder against the unfinished frame, saying nothing for a long moment. "No one coming after you then?" "No," she said. Then softer. "But some men remember what should stay buried in dust." He understood that more than he said. "Anybody ever laid claim to you before that town saw you?" Her chin lifted slightly. "No man owned me. I did what I had to. But I was no one's wife." He nodded once. "Then no one's got a say but you in where you stay now." They stood like that a while, both still, both breathing the same slow, heavy air. Finally, she spoke again. "If men come and ask who I am, you tell them wife. Then I must be that for real." He stepped forward, but not close enough to crowd her. A word at the door keeps rifles low and hands off. It doesn't chain you to a bed. It only becomes real if you choose it. Her eyes searched his face, not afraid, but weighing him like a truth she wasn't sure she could trust yet. "If I choose one day," she said softly, "you take that." The question hung there, a test, not a promise. Tahu didn't blink. "If you choose it," he said, "I take it. Not before." That was enough. One more crack in the distance between them sealed over. When night came, Asha placed another log on the fire and checked the door bar before climbing into bed. This time she folded the coat at the foot, instead of wearing it. Her hair spilled loose against the pillow shadows, catching in the waves. Tahu sat on the cot, half-unbuttoned shirt, clinging to his shoulders, the firelight flickering across the scar on his throat. He didn't look at her. She didn't watch him. But before her eyes closed, she spoke one last sentence into the quiet, a small truth that reached him clear as a prayer. "Now I remember how it feels, not to be afraid of the dark. My name means I am loved." "Asha Skybird," said softly, her voice steady this time. "But no one ever called me right. They said it was too long, too much. Tahu Stormwolf didn't repeat it aloud, but he held her name in his mind the way a man might hold a flame against the wind carefully, reverently. The lamp flickered once, then went dark. The coals in the stove popped and sighed, their glow dimming to a quiet red. For the first time, the night didn't press down like something closing in. It simply waited still and gentle until morning came. When dawn crept over the ridge, the world was quiet. No wind, no footsteps on the road. The air carried a dry bite, but not enough to keep them from stepping outside. Tahu checked the trough, the corral, and the spirit birds pecking around the fence they'd repaired the day before. Inside, Asha finished stitching the last hem of her mended dress and laid it over the chair. Her hands moved slow, unhurried, no glance at the door, no fear that someone might drag her out into the cold again. After breakfast, Tahu saddled Kitchi, tightening the straps with practiced hands. "I'm going to check the south pasture," he said. "Be back before noon." He didn't tell her to stay inside. She didn't ask if she could. She just nodded and stood on the porch, the coat's sleeves dangling past her wrists as he rode away. He didn't look back because he didn't need to. While he was gone, she moved through the cabin with quiet purpose. Not snooping, not searching, just taking measure of the space that was slowly becoming her own. She found a small tin of buttons and thread in the trunk but didn't open it. Some things weren't hers to touch. She knelt by the hearth, stirred the cold ash, and coaxed the stove back to life. When Tahu returned, Kitchi's hooves crunching the frozen dirt, she was sitting outside mending one of his work shirts against the cabin wall. The sight made him pause before dismounting. He watched her for a long moment, the way the sunlight caught her hair, the still focus in her shoulders. "Anything out there?" she asked, not looking up. "I still in one shirt." "Nothing but elk sign," he said, loosening the saddle. "You have any visitors?" She shook her head. "Only the hen tried to come inside." She pointed to a spirit bird pecking near the steps. He let out a low huff, almost a laugh, though quiet enough not to startle her. "She's been trying that since last winter." Inside, the warmth greeted them like an old dog. Tahu emptied his hunting sack, 2 rabbits and a quail, and Asha set a pot on the stove without needing to be asked. He watched the sure way she handled the knife, how she didn't flinch at the sight of blood. Then she spoke, voice low but certain. "When someone asks you, say I belong here. That true now? Or only when danger come?" He met her gaze, steady. "You're not here because I needed a cook or a bed filled," he said. "You're here because you didn't walk away. This place." He looked around the cabin, the half-built room, the firelight dancing across her face. "Belongs to both of us now, not just me." She studied him, waiting for the hidden lie that most men kept tucked under their promises. She didn't find one. "I stay," she said finally. "Not for food. Not because I cannot walk. I stay because no one come here to buy me, and you don't push me out when they don't pay." He gave one firm nod. "Then if anyone asks, I'll say what keeps them from circling, but I won't call you wife unless you want that." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the uneven edge of her sleeve, the loose strands of hair brushing her collar. "And if I'm ready before you ask." His jaw tightened, not in hesitation, but in resolve. "Then you don't have to wait for me to say it first." They stood that way, a single heartbeat stretched thin between them. Then she rested her hand lightly on his forearm. Not an offer, not a test, just a quiet understanding. He didn't pull away. He set his hand over hers the first time he'd touched her, since the day in Red Hollow. She didn't tremble. Later, when the stew was simmering and the sky had turned to gold dust behind the ridge. Asha brushed her hair with her fingers and asked, "You sleep on cot still?" Tahu looked toward the bed, then at her. "Been staying there so you'd have space. If that's changed, you tell me." She didn't look away. Different now. There was no rush, no reaching in hunger or fear. He waited for her to move first, and she did. Slow. Certain. She sat on the bed, unbuttoning the collar of her blouse, not to offer herself, but to show she wasn't hiding anymore. He sat beside her, close enough to feel her breath. She lifted her hand to his jaw, and their foreheads met before their lips did. The kiss was quiet, deliberate, a promise spoken without words. His hand came to rest behind her neck, not pulling, just holding. When she drew back, she leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing steady. Later, with the lamp blown out and the coat folded at the foot of the bed, she slipped beneath the blanket and rested her hand on his chest. He stayed awake long enough to feel the difference in her breathing. No sharp catches, no fear waiting for a blow. Before sleep took her, she whispered the words she hadn't dared to speak in town, her voice soft against the dark. "No one take me now, not while I stay with you." "Tahu," Stormwolf answered without hesitation. "No one will." Outside, the world was still. No riders came down the road. No faces looked through the window. The past stayed where it belonged, in dust and dead men's memories. And in that one-room cabin under a half-built roof and the faint hum of wind through the ridge, Asha Skybird stopped being a woman trying not to starve and became someone who finally chose to stay.